I mentioned in a video yesterday, day before, a few days ago, that it would be a good idea to have a separate video about my art style and specifically the style that I've been using for Same Wavelength, which is really just my art style, but maybe more pared down than some of the other work that I do. So I thought I'd put together just like a list of different artists and inspirations that I've had over the course of my art career, my graphic design career, and then also some of the other things that I'm seeing in the world around me and how that's created a kind of interest in line drawing and bright color in my work. So I do want to preface this by saying none of these images are mine. I don't own any of them. This is an educational video, and I'm not like making money off this to my knowledge. And if I do in the future, we'll deal with that then. But this is just an educational lecture about art history and some of my influences. So I really preface this with really huge captions of the names of the artists that I'm referencing, and I don't want to steal credit for anything. The only photos in this that I own are the ones of my own art, which I label at the end. So, with that out of the way, very lawyer conscious, um, the sort of history of art has been roughly divided between the history of drawing and the history of painting. And that's not true because there's sculpture and photography and all sorts of other things. But in terms of what an image is, I think we can think of it in terms of two things, those two things being color and line. And that's an ancient debate going back to the beginning of, Italian art, Greek art. This is not really a controversial opinion that color and line are both radically important for drawing and painting. So there's, all sorts of like ancient stories about, debates over what's more important, being able to shade correctly or being able to draw an outline correctly. And you can look into that on your own time. But I remember being taught those things in school. And I think maybe the best sort of way to think about those differences is when looking at artists like Beardsley and artists like Monet or other painters. And Beardsley has this perfect clean line illustration, which is also a term used for, I'm going to butcher the words, bande dessinée, which is like a Dutch, or not Dutch, my goodness. It's a style of comic book in, hold on, let me look it up. That's actually really embarrassing because I'm going to talk a bit about those comics later. Franco-Belgian comics. Um, And basically, that clear line, clean line aesthetic of just really having a precise delineation of space between black and white is really important. And I see that coming up in artists that are from different centuries, different parts of the globe, etc. On the flip side of this, you have work where the initial drawing of the painting is not even remotely visible. So much of the work has to do with shading and color more than it has to do with than just drawn shapes. And so I see that a lot in paintings like Monet. You'd be really hard pressed to just, recreate this exact image if you didn't have these, you know, shades and depth and different colors. Turning this into just a black and white line illustration would be a little bit difficult, especially where you have these patches of red. And we'll see a little bit later on that that's not exactly true because artists have done things like that. And especially Impressionism was not actually about blending colors. It was about, you know, creating effects in the eye through the use of just like different patches of color. So um, everything I'm saying, I'm going to reiterate and also turn on its head a little bit later. But for the intents and purposes of this discussion, I think of art generally in term, at least my art, in terms of line drawings like this, and then really colorful paintings that are not immediately able to be broken down into just line drawings like this. So moving on, I really want to talk about a variety of different artists, but the ones that I personally am inspired by the most at this moment in my life are Mobius and Hokusai. People know Hokusai for The Great Wave, which it isn't called that in Japanese. It's not even called the Japanese version of that. In Japanese, it's called something else. Um, and you can tell how educated I am about this before I gave this lecture. This was supposed to be just a fun impromptu thing, and then I took it a bit too seriously, but not seriously enough. But anyways, Hokusai, amazing artist, had an incredible longevity, famous for talking about how, he wasn't good at art until his late age, and if he only had 5 more years, 10 more years, he would have been even better, etc., etc. So that's some of his lore. Mobius Jean Giraud, yikes, bad at French, is a French artist who was famous for a lot of his sci-fi and fantasy work. He worked on movies like Tron and Alien, and did a lot of preparation for a version of Dune that never saw the light of day. And he also just had this perfect quality of line work. But his colors are really something I want to talk about as well. So I guess starting with Mobius, what I find interesting about his work is that the line, like the black and white version of each drawing of his in his comics, is an amazing work of art, and it is so radically different between that line work and then what the work looks like when it's colored in. I think he's one of the few artists who is really radically famous, not just for his line work, but also he was incredibly good at color. He was incredibly good at setting tone with color. He's famous for these beautiful gradients, and I know he worked with colorists too, so it wasn't just him, but it was his ideas. So, um, just it's marvelous to look at this work and then to really try to study like what makes a work of art great. And in my opinion, it's really interesting to study both the line and the color, and to sort of tease it apart and what things would look like if they were different colors, et cetera, et cetera. Not in a kind of scientific way, because that can really ruin a piece of art if you overanalyze it too much, but just in a way to help me with my own work, in choosing palettes and thinking about a piece and what it looks like and what it feels like. So I've been obsessed with his work for a really long time, and probably always will be. Similar, but not necessarily connected, is the work of Winsor McCay. It's possible that Mobius was inspired by Winsor McCay. I think most cartoonists have been. Um, Winsor McCay, famous for Gertie the dinosaur and the Rabbit Fiend and Little Nemo, not the fish. Um, his work was just unbelievably extraordinary. Um, Side note here, obviously, artists uh, of the past and present n not necessarily working under the most perfect set of ethics. This is my disclaimer saying that if you look into some of Winsor McCay's work, uh, there are racial stereotypes in a lot of it. Not to justify any of the stuff that he did, but he worked in an era where that was chill, apparently. So I'm not endorsing any of that. Just a sidebar if someone researches him after this. But um, that being said, historically, it's really important to look at work like this because it inspired a lot of the stuff that came later, and it's really interesting to look at this stuff in terms of architecture, in terms of movement, in terms of, Winsor McCay was a person who was good at drawing not only people in caricature, but also objects, everyday objects, architecture, space, etc. So super interesting. I don't know who handled the coloring of Winsor McCay's comics. I don't know if it was him, but also really fantastic work in some of that work. This is work by another cartoonist, Osbert Lancaster, whose work I've recently discovered, and he ignore this. This is an artifact of some other image. He also was like incredibly good at architecture and people. Obviously not like entirely realistic, and both of these artists that I'm looking at definitely have like cartooniness built into their work based on what things looked like at the time. Like you can almost always tell when a comic is from like the 1920s because it has not only the certain clothing associated with the time, but like and those cars and the things that look that certain way, but also just the kinds of noses and the kinds of eyeballs and things like that. So not necessarily you can't always really know when a drawing is from, but like some of those stylistic indicators are there and are pretty interesting. And also Mobius, like definitely cartoony. Like some of his work famously very similar to the human figure. He studied anatomy, or drawing anatomy. Some of it famously really abstract, as we'll see later. So another artist I want to talk about is it Harry Clark or Henry Clark? Let me look that up. Um, but his work is really similar to Aubrey Beardsley, and they both, I mean, they're actually pretty different in terms of like the content and aesthetic, Harry Clark, um, of the work, but similar, like goth, black and white, like wonderful uses of pattern and just like absolutely stunning ethereal imagery. Um, Here's a color piece that I found from him, which is actually pretty interesting and not what I immediately think of when I think of his work. Oh, and there's another artist named, I want to say Nielsen, that has similar work also to this style. So these are all things that I'm thinking about that are influencing the work that I do. Like when I'm doing a drawing and I just have a figure, if I just had this figure, it would be really stunning on its own, like the Hokusai figure, but then how does that figure exist against a graphic background of different, like black and white shapes and patterns and textures and styles and things? So that's sort of what I'm grappling with is figure in space when it comes to my posters and my stickers and drawings and things. So um, I wanted to go back to Mobius and talk about abstraction. I think one of the things that makes his work so good is that he's clearly looking at the real world and drawing from life, but also has this fantastic imagination. So like you would I'm sure he's never seen a figure that looks like this, but like the physics of the clothing, even if it's not accurate to what a piece of clothing would be doing, it feels real because there's so much of that study built into it. Similarly, there's something so wonderful about these images where like the clothing feels like it could be real, but the faces are clearly cartoonish. So it's cool to have that mixture of work, and it builds out this style that I think is so interesting and wonderful. So the next thing I really want to talk about is what I talked about at the beginning with the peaches, which is how to take the opposite of line work, which is shade and shadow and color and, tones and shading, and break it up into bits of color. So the Impressionists were really interested in Japan, and there was a time basically where a bunch of flatline Japanese prints were brought into France and Europe in general. And I'm not directly saying that like Van Gogh and Matisse were inspired by them in these pieces, which I don't think they are, but that sort of divide where you have something that's technically a painting or a print, those are different things, but you have, this entirely different style of painting to what's been going on in the Western world. And it creates this sort of fissure where you say, well, what would it actually mean to break up a blended painting of maybe a background is going from like red to blue for the sunset. And what if we actually just had blocks of color? And if we had really tiny blocks of color, maybe the eye is going to be doing the blending at a distance. And then you have impressionism, you have pointillism, you have all of these other things. So I do think Van Gogh is this very interesting case of someone who is using abstraction and stylizing and all of these other tools to make really interesting art. And I think one of the things at the core of that is this way that he's basically using paint to make drawings. And a lot of his work becomes this very like not cartoony in a bad sense, but like almost like print-like, drawing-like quality to it that is really fascinating. And I'm doing a really bad job of explaining this, and people have, explained his work for years and years and years, much better than I have. But this is sort of what I'm getting out of his work, as I think of his work as a great example of really blending these two really difficult things, which are beautiful, wonderful colors and gradients and hard line, clean line drawings. So Matisse is also an example of this where especially in his later work with the paper cutouts, he has these incredibly flat, like blocks of color that are creating geometries, that are creating textures and patterns. And in some of the work, it's very flat and like clearly 2D. And some of it, there's like very layered effects with the flat components. And that really makes me think of graphic design. Graphic design to me, obviously, encompasses every style of graphic design that's ever existed. But the stuff that I'm drawn to the most personally is stuff with really good, clear drawings. And in this, you can kind of see what I was talking about earlier about how, oh, it would be so hard to have this blended gradient broken up into just patches of color, but it's being done here, and it's being done here really well. And it gives an entirely different effect. Um, but it's still beautiful and interesting and cool and good. And I'd argue, um, even though I'm an oil painter and a watercolor painter, something like this is even more in my wheelhouse in terms of my design work, than like using brush strokes to like blend things, because that's not really what I'm bringing into the same wavelength work. The next thing I wanted to expound on is more of the Japanisme stuff that I was talking about earlier, where artists were like actually very much literally inspired by Japanese art. Again, I'm going to butcher the term, but I think it's ukiyo-e, which is like this era of print making from Japan, directly inspired Marie Cassatt, Jesus Christ. I'm really losing it today. But her work, like this is actually from a series of prints that she's emulating that style in. And some could even say directly ripping it off, which is, again, degrees of respect and copying and influence are, you know, there it's very much up for debate in art history. So I do want to say I don't like condone artists copying things, but it's not clear to what extent something is an inspiration and something is outright theft, and that's always been the case for art history, especially now with AI, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is what I'm interested in, is these like clear thin lines and then just one color, one flat color, and how that creates these very interesting effects. Same thing with Monet and a Hokusai print. You see a lot of sort of interesting cues being taken from Japan. And I think it's very interesting that there's been this very long history between France and Japan of cross-cultural conversation about art. So I find that very interesting. These are objects that just influence me in my day-to-day life. They're not, they don't have to do with anything necessarily, but this is like a bar of soap I bought my boyfriend today that I've been obsessing over for like a year. This is sake we had yesterday, and this is a Lego piece that I had as a kid or like saw. Actually, I have it now, but I had the stuffed animal version of this from Legoland as a kid. Again, I don't own these images. I didn't design them. They're just things I own that are influencing me. And just the aesthetic of this, like, obviously made me like I was thinking about this when I was designing my crocodilian poster. None of the drawings are from this image. And I really tried to do different things in my drawing because again, I don't ever want to rip something off. And so all those crocodilians are from images, mostly, I think, if not all, open source. Um, and they're obviously real crocodilians, not like a Lego piece. But this is the aesthetic that's driving a lot of my artwork. This I really wanted to talk about. These are screenshots I took maybe yesterday about the most recent ChatGPT update, which I do not endorse, that is making it so much easier for art to be ripped off. And these are images of what characters from Stranger Things would look like in a Ghibli movie. And these are incredibly accurate images. The new update is very good at emulation. And it's very concerning to me because, you know, these computers are able to make art from stolen images without copyright in fractions of seconds. You know, something like this, even if I was the best artist in the world, would take me an hour at least to create. So you have all of these concerns about artists being, you know, absolutely destroyed by AI, and that's a topic for another day. But I thought it was interesting that, like, you know, Ghibli is also an example of a clean line um, anime with flat color that just like does an excellent job of creating vibes and feelings and whatnot. And Ghibli was also inspired by Mobius, which so that sort of makes sense, another French-Japanese connection. But this is really something to be concerned about and something to be interested in. Like I spend so much time being worried about copyright and respecting original artists, respecting original photos, and then you have stuff like this that's not respecting anyone. And again, I don't own these images. I don't know if this will get taken down for copyright or whatever, but I'm criticizing this. But it's also something to be, it's a marvel also, that it is so accurate now because it used to not be. So it's crazy how quickly things have changed. That all being said, this is my work. The skulls are from my thesis project where I was doing like science graphic design, and this is the same wavelength stuff, which is also science graphic design. And I'm really interested in things like blueprints and architectural studies and all of these other technical drawings. I also use a rapidograph pen to do not all of the illustrations, but a lot of them. So I'm interested in this precision. I have another marker that's a Pilot Bravo, I think, which I used to make the frogs and a few other of the posters. Everything is hand drawn by me before I bring it into the computer. And these are the things that I'm thinking about. I really want to cultivate an aesthetic that's true to my art, but also honors all of these other art forms and the long history of artists being influenced by each other, but I don't want to rip anything off. Um, I contemplated going to law school for a while. I have connections to lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been given a lot of really bad advice to do illegal things in terms of art, to sell art. And I don't take that advice because I really want to honor all the other artists around me in the history of art. And unfortunately, we live in an era where that's just not an option anymore for so many other people, in the sense that people have just decided not to be ethical in terms of AI, in terms of stealing people's designs and then having them printed on t-shirts and selling them for like $3. There's a lot of theft when it comes to art, and I am concerned about that for my work. I don't want to get ripped off, but I can't imagine a situation in which I would want to stoop to the level of ripping other people's work off. That's not the point of being an artist and having an artistic career. So all of that is to say, it's interesting to think about the ethics connecting these things. It's interesting to think about um, abject theft versus influence, and that's, true in music sampling, that's true in painting, that's true in fashion, and every industry has its own ways of dealing with these things and ethics and laws and things. But all of that is to say, this is my style and I'm sticking to it, and it's what I'm interested in, and I hope that clarifies some stuff. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.